Here. Wanted to do a live video as I'm driving home here from an event I was at. I tried going live a few minutes back and was talking when I noticed I guess I'd lost reception there for a bit going through some mountains, but should hopefully be good to go for the rest of my drive home here. So if you want to join in here, who knows who will. It's Sunday evening. Everybody's probably watching football, but I want to talk a little bit about some things I just learned at this event I was at. I was listening to a lecture, I suppose you could call it, at an annual meeting for the French and Indian War Foundation based in Winchester, Virginia. And French and Indian War in Virginia, you might say. Well, yeah, they kind of started it. Virginians started the French and Indian War, and Winchester, Virginia, was the post, you would say, of George Washington from 1756 to 1758. George Washington built a fort in Winchester, Virginia, which he named Fort Loudon, not to be confused with fort of the same name in Pennsylvania. And so there was a gentleman who was the guest speaker today at this event, who is a National Park Ranger at the French and Indian War sites in western Pennsylvania of George Washington's Fort Necessity, and at the Jumonville Glen, which we're going to mostly talk about. 1753, I think late 1750 year. I know it was cold, maybe even early 1754, but I think it was 53. George Washington and a gentleman, Christopher Gist, have been tasked by colonial governor Dinwiddie of Virginia to take a trip up into what is now western Pennsylvania. Kind of everything was Virginia back then. Virginia went from like the Chesapeake Bay to the Mississippi River back then. So yeah, Virginia and Pennsylvania even had disputes over this territory at some point. You know, the area they called the Ohio Country back then. There was a Virginia company, the Ohio Company, they called it. It was one of the principal investors, owners, I guess you could say, was George Washington's older brother, Lawrence. And I believe George himself owned stock in the company as well. So George Washington and Christopher Gist were tasked by the governor of Virginia to go tell the French who were in the Ohio Country to get out. This is British territory. And they made their way up towards northwestern Pennsylvania, kind of almost all the way up to where Erie, Pennsylvania is, or if you like your case knives, Bradford, Pennsylvania, up in that area. I don't know the exact location of this place, but it was Fort Le Boeuf. They made their way there and spoke with the French commander of the fort, and they told him, well, George told him to vacate the Ohio Country. And he says, well, I'll relay this message to my superiors, but yeah, we're not really going to do that. So George Washington eventually made his way back to Virginia and gave the news to Governor Dinwiddie. Now that was late 1753, maybe early 54. It was sometime in the cold weather. Later that spring, May time frame, we'll say, Washington was back in the Ohio Country with a force of about 150 men or so. He was supposed to get more, but wasn't able to enlist in this expedition. And so George was, you know, the leader of this group. I believe he was a major at the time, maybe even colonel, rank in the Virginia militia. And he was going to attack the French at a new fort they had built at the confluence of the Ohio, Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The FU crew, thanks for listening here, and just saw your comment. So George was going up there with 150 men and some Indian allies under the leadership of who we know, and I guess, you know, he was known to his people and definitely the British as the Half King. His real name was something like Tanagreeson, or something to that effect. But we'll call him the Half King because that's much easier to say. He was some sort of Iroquois, and I'm not sure his exact tribe, but I believe he was a representative of the Iroquois Confederacy. So these guys are going to go on to Fort Duquesne and attack it. But they don't really make it there, as some Indian tribes are siding with the French. And they go to Fort Duquesne and tell the French, hey, there's this force of British folks coming up. And the commander of Fort Duquesne sends out a reconnaissance party to reconnoiter the situation of these British troops. And a reconnoiter is a nicer, fancier way of saying basically they go spy on these dudes, see what they're up to. So he does, and this person in charge of this party is Ensign Jumonville. And Jumonville is his last name. A bunch of other French names before that I don't recall, and you know, it's too hard because the French have too many names. So we'll just refer to him as his last name, Jumonville, and maybe his rank ensign. And Jumonville has a party of... So Ensign Jumonville travels around looking for these British troops that are under command of George Washington. And Jumonville has a message for them. Get out of here. This is French land. And Jumonville is on, I suppose, diplomatic mission. Peaceful, like to tell the British ever so kindly to go away. Eventually, George Washington found out that was area to Indian scouts and allies. And the French were camped at a place, you know, off of, you know, what would become the next year the Braddock Road. At the time, you know, after this, it would actually hold the name of Washington Road, because Washington did a lot to build this road. But then General Braddock came through town the next year and built his road. Now, George Washington led a group of 40 or so guys through the night to this site where the French were encamped for the night. And they marched all night to get to this site. They left at like 10 o'clock p.m. and got there just before dawn. So all these French guys are probably asleep when Washington and his men arrive. And there's a few different accounts of what happens next. There's a shot fired. Some people say George Washington fired the first shot himself. They were up on some rocks. So the French were encamped in a rock face, at the base of a rock face. It had been raining and it was windy, so the French came down here, used this rock face as a windshield, and built some like lean-tos to camp out under. It was not like a long-term camp. They were just, hanging out here for the night, maybe a day or two while that rainy weather passes, so they could continue on and find the British force. And they were found. And fired upon. In their sleep, probably. There was a guard, because, they are a military force, but the guard kind of ran away when the British were coming. So the British were really the ones firing the shots, because the French were having difficulty because of the rainy weather. I had mentioned a lot of their gunpowder had gotten wet, and we don't know for sure, but the French may not have even fired a shot in this engagement. But the British assuredly did, as well as their Indian allies under the leadership of the Half-King. And the Half-King was present at this incident in this Glen, which we today call Jumonville Glen, after the French commander. This was probably just a few minutes of skirmish. George Washington wrote in his letters after the action that it was a 15-minute battle. It was probably a lot less, and not much of a battle at all. It was pretty one-sided, from what I understand. Now, Washington was firing down, from what I understand, from the top of this rock face into the French encampment, with Indian forces going on the flanks. So they had fantastic military position, Washington and those under his command. So the French were kind of running over this way, but over this way was where the Half-King had circled around. And the Half-King and his men killed probably 8 to 11 French soldiers as they came down into where they were positioned. And the French kind of surrendered at that point, and Jumonville was standing around. I believe he was speaking with Washington and was saying, he was there on a diplomatic mission and all that, when the Half-King put a tomahawk probably right into his face. And that was the end of Jumonville. The Half-King had a vendetta against the French, because apparently the French had murdered and eaten his father. And George Washington was I guess kind of flabbergasted at what had just happened here. And he didn't really know what to do. So he went back to where the rest of his force was and built a fort. Basically a wood palisade with a trench around it in a circular shape. George Washington didn't know anything about building forts. He was a farmer, not an engineer. He was a farmer and a surveyor, not a fort builder. or an architect. It was not a great defensive structure. Plus, he was only like 21, 22 years old at this point. Now, Fort Necessity eventually fell, and Washington had to sign some terms of surrender that were written in French, basically saying that this whole incident was his fault and he assassinated Ensign Jumonville. And that was the French and Indian War. Now, back at the French camp, known as Jumonville, Glen, named after Ensign Jumonville, who was killed there by the Half-King. So, the place, the site of this, had been known, passed down through the generations. It was private property. And there was the National Park Service took over. This is where it happened. And there's a trail there to go down into the Glen on the campsite and all that. Then the rock face is of course there. But people hadn't really 100% understood or known where things happened because there was never an archaeological excavation until the spring of this year, 2023, where the ranger who was at this event I was at, he got this archaeological excavation to take place to investigate the site of Jumonville Glen. And I thought that was extremely fascinating that no archaeological work had taken place here for an event that seems rather important in history. That sparked a world war. We think the French-Indian War, a bunch of folks fighting in western Pennsylvania and New York up into Canada, but it took place on every continent except for Australia and Antarctica, because that was the stretch of the British and French empires of the time. They were influencers, colonizers all over the world. It wasn't just in North America that this conflict took place. And it was started by those actions at Jumonville Glen, a little place in nowhere of western Pennsylvania. So this year they did an archaeological excavation on the site, old pull tabs from beer and soda, and found like a crowbar, shell. I keep cutting out, folks. They did find 5 musket balls, varying from like 62 to 68 caliber, and that was big because those were maybe the first shots of the French and Indian War and what started the World War, the 7 Years' War. Maybe George Washington himself shot one of those rounds. And they did find just the 5, and they were all fired. They were not balls that, someone had dropped from their pouch. They were all fired. And from, if you've been listening this whole time, they were likely all fired by British troops, because the French were taken by surprise and their powder had been wet, and who knows, maybe they didn't even get a shot off. And maybe they were fired by Indians as well, as they did have guns, but they did have mostly their traditional weapons at the time, bows, arrows, clubs, and all that. So they did find those on the site. So which really confirms it was actually the site that this happened. And they found, evidence and confirmed. They were able to get like a spot where Washington and the Indians had met, like a crest of a hill, and then split up to the flank and make like an L ambush on the French. They were able to confirm, those types of things from descriptions of people who were at the battle. So there's three main accounts of the battle. There is one Frenchman who gave his account. There's Washington, and then there was one of the Iroquois who gave their account of what happened. And most people, I guess, or at least the ranger who was speaking at this event, agrees that the Iroquois account is probably the most accurate of what happened there that day. So it was really fascinating to hear this, and I'm glad I was able to share it with you today. I believe the event I was at was recorded, so for YouTube. So hopefully I can share that with you on my community page. I'm going to look it up when I get home and share that with you, because it was really fascinating to hear this presentation, and I'm glad I went. And thank you to everyone and anyone who tuned in to listen to me rehash what I learned here on my ride home. So take it easy, and we'll see you next time.